The question wasn't what he ate. It was why only tuna? Why would a stray cat, ribs like washboard slats beneath his patchy fur, turn his nose up at expensive kibble, gourmet wet food, even freshly cooked chicken? Why, when offered anything else, would those haunted, sea-glass green eyes just close? As if the very sight offended him. As if he'd rather starve than betray some invisible, deeply held principle. Before we begin, if stories like this touch your heart, please like the video, subscribe for more, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're listening from. It means a lot to us. It was October 12th. Sarah knew the date because it marked 3 months since the last box was taped shut. 3 months since the sold sign went up on her childhood home. 3 months since the echoing silence of her new, smaller apartment near the old train yards had started to feel less like space and more like a vacuum. A vacuum where her mother's laughter used to be. The air that morning held the sharp, clean bite of early autumn, carrying the scent of damp earth and wood smoke from distant chimneys. Golden leaves, crisp and fragile, skittered like lost coins across the cracked pavement outside her kitchen window. Inside, the radiator hissed and knocked, a futile protest against the creeping chill that seeped through the single-pane glass. Sarah stood at the sink, watching her breath fog the cold surface for a second before wiping it clear. The silence pressed in. It was the kind of quiet that amplified the small, sad orchestra of her own thoughts. The clink of her mug on the counter. The too loud swallow of lukewarm tea. The relentless tick of the clock her mother had given her, a cheerful, painted rooster that now felt like a mocking reminder of time passing without her. She traced a finger over the chipped enamel. Grief, she was learning, wasn't always a crashing wave. Sometimes it was this hollow ache. A constant, low-grade hum of absence. She felt adrift, untethered in this unfamiliar neighborhood, surrounded by the ghosts of a life packed away in cardboard. And then he appeared, as he did most mornings now. A shadow detaching itself from the deeper gloom beneath Mrs. Henderson's overgrown lilac bush across the alley. He moved with a peculiar, stiff-legged gait, not quite a limp, but the careful steps of someone, or something, perpetually bracing for impact. His coat was a battlefield tapestry, swirls of faded ginger, dirty white, and patches of raw, pink skin where fur refused to grow back. One ear was notched, a ragged V missing from its tip. He paused at the edge of Sarah's tiny, concrete backyard, head low, scanning. Not just for danger, Sarah thought, but with a weary, ancient vigilance. Like a soldier still patrolling a long-abandoned post. He saw her at the window. Stopped dead. Those green eyes locked onto hers. Not pleading. Not demanding. Just seeing. Assessing. There was an unnerving depth in that gaze, an intelligence that felt almost human. Weird. Sarah felt a familiar pang, part sympathy, part the raw edge of her own loneliness reaching out. She'd tried ignoring him at first, tried shooing him away with a flick of the dish towel. But the sight of him, hunched against the wind one rainy afternoon, shivering but refusing to take shelter under her offered cardboard box, had cracked something open inside her. A vulnerability recognizing vulnerability. She'd started leaving food out. A saucer of milk, ignored. Dry kibble, sniffed, then dismissed with a look of profound disappointment. Canned cat food in savory gravy, barely touched. It was only when, desperate, she'd opened a can of tuna for her own lunch and placed the juice-drenched flakes on a paper plate that he'd approached. Slowly, suspiciously. He'd eaten with a fierce, focused intensity that bordered on violence, gulping down the fish as if afraid it would vanish. But only the tuna. He meticulously avoided even a single piece of the kibble she'd mixed in as a test. "All right, mister," Sarah murmured now, her breath clouding the glass again, obscuring him for a moment. "Tuna it is." She opened the back door just wide enough to slide the small blue ceramic bowl, her mother's old sugar bowl, repurposed, onto the top step. The pungent, briny smell of the fish hit the cold air. Instantly, the cat's head snapped up. He didn't rush. He never rushed. He took measured steps, each one deliberate, his gaze flicking between the bowl and Sarah's face, still half hidden behind the door. He ate, head down, shoulders hunched, a low, almost inaudible rumble vibrating in his chest. Not a purr. More like the growl of a distant engine. Sarah watched the rhythmic movement of his jaw, the way his scarred flank trembled slightly with the effort. She named him Samson in her head, for the notched ear and the air of fallen strength. He finished the tuna, meticulously licking the bowl clean until it shone. Then he sat back on his haunches, looking not at Sarah, but past her, through the open kitchen door, his gaze fixed on something inside. Something unseen. It wasn't hunger in his eyes now. It was something else. A quiet intensity. A focus that made Sarah shiver despite the warmth bleeding from the doorway. He stood, stretched, one stiff foreleg extending, claws scraping faintly on the concrete. Then, instead of slinking back towards the lilacs, he turned. And with that same deliberate, unhurried pace, he walked purposefully down the alley. Not wandering. Not foraging. Going somewhere. Past the overflowing dumpsters, past Mr. Gable's perpetually half-painted fence, towards the row of slightly grander, older houses that backed onto the alley further down. Houses with gardens, sheds, back porches. Houses Sarah didn't know. A gust of wind rattled the dry leaves, sending a shower of gold skittering around Sarah's ankles. She pulled her thin cardigan tighter. The silence in her apartment yawned behind her, vast and cold. The image of the cats retreating back, moving with such strange purpose, lodged itself in her mind. That bowl licked spotless. The absolute refusal of anything but tuna. The look in his eyes. It wasn't just pickiness. It felt like a message. A silent plea she couldn't decipher. Her fingers curled around the cold edge of the door. The hollow ache inside her pulsed, not just with grief now, but with a sudden, sharp spike of curiosity. It felt reckless. Foolish. Following a stray cat? But the alternative was stepping back into the quiet apartment. Back into the ticking clock and the weight of the unpacked boxes marked Mom. Back into the vacuum. Sarah took a breath. The air tasted of autumn decay and distant smoke. Her heart thudded, a quick, nervous rhythm against her ribs. She stepped out onto the cold concrete step, pulling the door almost closed behind her. She didn't grab a coat. She just started walking. Following the path the cat had taken, her worn sneakers whispering against the gritty pavement. The alley stretched before her, a tunnel of weathered brick and chain link. And somewhere ahead, a small, battle-scarred creature moved with quiet purpose. A purpose she suddenly, desperately, needed to understand. A quiet shift, deep within her own numb heart, had begun. The ache wasn't just absence anymore. It was the first faint stirring of a question demanding an answer. She quickened her step, the crisp leaves crunching underfoot, a counterpoint to the sudden, hopeful hammering in her chest. The alley was colder than Sarah expected. The high brick walls on either side blocked the weak October sun, casting the narrow passage into perpetual, damp twilight. The air smelled of wet concrete, rotting leaves trapped in chain-link fences, and the faint, metallic tang of the distant train tracks. Her sneakers scuffed softly on the uneven pavement, the sound unnervingly loud in the stillness. Ahead, Samson moved like a gray ghost against the grimy brick. Not running, not hiding, but walking with that same deliberate, unhurried purpose. He didn't look back. Not once. It was as if he knew she was there and had expected her to follow. Sarah's breath hitched. What was she doing? Following a half-feral cat into the unknown depths of a neighborhood she barely knew? The sensible part of her screamed to turn back. Back to the hissing radiator. Back to the ticking rooster clock. Back to the safe numbness of her grief. But the sight of his small, determined figure, ribs still too visible beneath the patchy fur, vanishing around a bend, it pulled her forward. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It felt like a thread, thin but insistent, connecting her hollow core to this strange, scarred creature. A thread spun from shared loneliness, perhaps. Or maybe just the desperate need for something to matter outside the confines of her own sorrow. He led her deeper, past overflowing dumpsters buzzing with flies, past sagging wooden fences plastered with faded band flyers, past the pungent aroma of Mr. Gable's perpetually simmering cabbage escaping from a cracked window. Samson never deviated. He walked the center line of the alley, tail held low but not tucked, an island of quiet intent in the urban decay. Sarah kept her distance, staying close to the walls, her heart thumping a nervous rhythm against her ribs. She felt exposed, foolish. A 32-year-old woman creeping after a cat. Yet, the further they went, the less the apartment's silence seemed like an option. The vacuum was filling, with the chill air, the gritty scent of the alley, the focus required to keep Samson's retreating back in sight. He stopped abruptly. Not at a door, but at a section of fence nearly swallowed by a towering, unkempt hedge of lilac and forsythia. The wood was old, weathered gray, with several slats missing or hanging loose. Samson slipped through one of the gaps with practiced ease, disappearing into the tangle of branches and shadow. Sarah halted, peering into the dimness beyond the fence. This wasn't a back door. It was a secret passage. Her palms felt slick. Trespassing. This was definitely trespassing. She glanced around. The alley was deserted. Only the distant rumble of a train and the cawing of crows broke the silence. Taking a deep breath that did little to steady her nerves, Sarah crouched down. The gap Samson had used was small. She'd have to crawl. The cold, damp earth seeped through the knees of her jeans instantly. Pushing aside brittle branches that scratched at her arms, she squeezed through. Thorns snagged her cardigan. The smell changed dramatically, damp earth, decaying vegetation, and beneath it, something else, something faintly floral, almost sweet, buried under years of neglect. Catmint, maybe? She emerged into a forgotten corner of a large, wildly overgrown garden. It felt like stepping into a different world, frozen in time. Tangled rose bushes clawed at the air. A stone bird bath lay cracked and dry, choked with moss. Weeds grew waist-high where lawn might have once been. And presiding over it all, at the far end near the back of a large, imposing Victorian house, stood a weathered stone statue of a woman, her features smoothed by time and weather, gazing sightlessly across the wilderness. The house itself loomed, dark and silent. Curtains drawn tight on every visible window. No smoke from the chimney. An air of profound abandonment hung heavy in the still air. Sarah scanned the undergrowth. Where had he gone? A flicker of movement near the base of the statue. Samson sat there, perfectly still, his green eyes fixed on the back door of the house. It was painted a faded blue, peeling in long strips. He wasn't looking for food. He wasn't meowing. He was simply waiting, watching, as if expecting the door to open. Sarah crouched lower behind a thicket of overgrown lavender, the scent sharp and calming despite her racing heart. Minutes ticked by. The silence was profound, broken only by the rustle of a sparrow in the ivy climbing the house. Samson didn't move. He remained a small, vigilant sentinel at the foot of the forgotten statue. Sarah watched him, the cold seeping into her bones, her earlier recklessness replaced by a dawning, unsettling understanding. This wasn't a random haunt. This place meant something to him. The absolute stillness, the focused intensity, it wasn't hunger. It was devotion, a vigil. The realization landed like a physical weight. This scarred, wary creature, who flinched at sudden movements and refused all but Tuna, held a loyalty so fierce it drew him daily to this silent, decaying threshold. Who was he waiting for? What had happened here? Sarah thought of her mother's empty chair, the silence in her own apartment, the way she sometimes caught herself staring at the phone, half expecting it to ring with her mother's cheerful greeting. Was that what this was? A cat's version of waiting for a ghost? A wave of empathy, sharp and sudden, washed over her, momentarily eclipsing her fear of trespassing. She understood that kind of waiting. The hollow ache of absence. The irrational hope that defied logic. She saw her own reflection in Samson's unwavering vigil. They were both creatures adrift, tethered to ghosts. A sudden noise shattered the stillness, the sharp crack of a twig snapping nearby. Sarah froze. Samson's head whipped around, ears flattened, body tense to flee. His eyes locked not on the source of the sound, but directly onto Sarah's hiding place. He'd known she was there all along. The intensity in his gaze wasn't fear, exactly. It was assessment. A silent question hanging in the cold air. Why are you here? Before she could react, a large crow landed with a raucous caw on the stone woman's head. Samson flinched violently, a low hiss escaping him. In a flash of ginger and white, he bolted, not towards the alley gap, but deeper into the tangled garden, vanishing behind a thick clump of ornamental grasses. Panic flared in Sarah's chest. He was gone. She'd scared him off. Or the crow had. Stupid, stupid. She'd invaded his sanctuary, disrupted his vigil. The fragile thread between them felt severed. Pushing aside the scratchy lavender branches, she stumbled into the clearing near the statue, scanning the overgrown wilderness frantically. "Samson," she whispered, the name feeling strange and too loud on her lips. "Hey, it's okay. I'm sorry." Nothing. Only the sigh of wind through dead leaves and the distant, mocking caw of the crow. The back door of the silent house seemed to loom larger, more forbidding. The abandoned garden felt suddenly oppressive, filled with the ghost Samson was waiting for, and now her own intrusion. The hollow ache returned, sharper now, laced with a new kind of loneliness, the loneliness of having briefly touched something real and wild, only to have it vanish. She hugged herself, shivering violently, not just from the cold. What had she expected? A friendly reunion? An explanation? She was about to turn back, shame and disappointment warring within her, when she heard it. A soft rustle, very close. She held her breath. From behind the thick base of the stone statue, a single cautious green eye appeared. Then a whiskered muzzle. Samson peered out, his body still half concealed. He didn't approach. He didn't flee. He just watched her. His chest moved rapidly with shallow breaths. Slowly, Sarah lowered herself to sit on the cold, moss-covered base of the statue. She drew her knees up, making herself small, non-threatening. She looked away, focusing on a cluster of determined yellow dandelions pushing through the cracks in the stone path. She didn't speak. She just sat, breathing, trying to radiate calm she didn't feel, trying to apologize without words. Minutes stretched. The crow flew off. The wind died down. The only sounds were Sarah's own heartbeat and Samson's quiet breathing from behind the statue. Then movement. Not a bolt, but a slow, hesitant creep. One stiff leg, then another. He emerged fully, keeping the statue between himself and Sarah, but his gaze never left her. He circled warily, maintaining distance, sniffing the air. He stopped near the spot where she'd crouched earlier, investigating the crushed lavender stems with intense concentration. His nose twitched. He looked back at her. A question. "Your scent?" Sarah stayed perfectly still. She focused on the rough, cold texture of the stone beneath her, the sweet decay of the garden, the faint, lingering smell of tuna that somehow clung to her fingers. She let her shoulders slump, trying to project exhaustion, not threat. Another slow circle. Closer this time. He paused, just out of arm's reach, his head tilted. Those sea-glass eyes studied her face with an unnerving directness. It wasn't the assessing stare of before. It was different, softer, curious. He took one more step, then another. The gap between them narrowed to a few feet. He sat down, wrapping his thin tail tightly around his paws. He didn't purr. He didn't blink slowly. He just sat, watching her, sharing the cold, silent space before the blue door. It wasn't affection. Not yet. It was tolerance. A ceasefire. An acknowledgement of presence. But in that shared silence, in the simple act of not fleeing, Samson offered something Sarah hadn't felt since her mother died. A sense of being seen. Not as the grieving daughter, not as the woman adrift in a new apartment, but simply as another being existing in this moment, in this forgotten garden, bound by a shared, unspoken sorrow. The cold seeped deeper, but Sarah didn't move. She matched his stillness. The rooster clocks ticking felt a million miles away. Here, there was only the rustle of dry grass, the distant train whistle, the slow, steady rhythm of her own breathing, and the quiet, watchful presence of a battle-scarred cat who refused to eat anything but tuna. The thread between them, fragile as spider silk, hadn't snapped. It had merely stretched and held. A gust of wind sent a flurry of golden leaves dancing around them. One landed softly on Sarah's knee. Samson's eyes tracked its descent, then flicked back to her face. He didn't startle. He just observed. Sarah felt a warmth bloom in her chest, unexpected and fragile, pushing back against the chill. It wasn't happiness. It was connection. Faint, tentative, but undeniably real. She slowly extended a hand, palm down, fingers relaxed, not reaching for him, just resting on her own knee near the fallen leaf. An offering. An invitation without demand. Samson looked at her hand. He looked at the blue door. He looked back at her hand. Time suspended. The world narrowed to the space between her fingers and his watchful green eyes. Then, with infinite slowness, he stood. Not to leave, but to take a single, deliberate step forward. Then another. He stopped just shy of her fingertips. He lowered his head, not to sniff her hand, but to gently, cautiously press the top of his scarred, notched head against her knuckles. The touch was brief, fleeting, cool, rough fur against her skin. A jolt of pure, electric surprise shot through Sarah. It wasn't affection, not really. It felt more like a test. A tentative bridge built over a chasm of mutual loss and caution. He held the contact for only a heartbeat, then pulled back, his eyes wide, watching her reaction intently. Sarah didn't move her hand. She didn't try to grab him. A lump formed in her throat, so large it hurt. Tears, unexpected and hot, pricked her eyes. Not tears of sadness this time. Tears of recognition, of being touched, of that thin, fragile thread suddenly humming with a current of shared existence. She blinked the tears back, offering the ghost of a smile, her voice a husky whisper lost in the garden's silence. "Okay, Samson. Okay." He held her gaze for a long moment. Then, without warning, he turned. Not towards the alley gap, but towards the weathered blue door of the silent house. He padded right up to it, sat down facing it, and resumed his vigil. His posture was different now. Less rigid, less alone. Sarah stayed seated on the cold stone, her knuckles still tingling where his head had pressed, watching the small, steadfast figure before the door. The question hadn't been answered. The mystery of the tuna, the vigil, the silent house, it all remained. But something fundamental had shifted in the quiet, overgrown garden. The follower and the followed had become, in that fleeting touch, something else entirely. Companions in the long, patient wait before a closed blue door. The hollow ache inside Sarah didn't vanish, but for the first time in months, it didn't feel quite so empty. It held the echo of a cat's silent vigil and the lingering warmth of a single, unexpected touch. The shared silence in the overgrown garden didn't last. A sharp clatter echoed from the alley, the sound of a metal trash can lid hitting the pavement. Samson flinched violently, a low growl rumbling deep in his chest. In a flash of ginger and white, he was gone, vanishing into the tangled undergrowth faster than Sarah could blink. Gone, just like that. Leaving her alone on the cold stone base, the phantom warmth of his brief touch fading instantly from her knuckles, replaced by the damp chill of the air. The suddenness of his departure felt like a door slamming shut. Sarah sat frozen for a moment, the garden suddenly feeling vast and hostile again. The silent blue door seemed to mock her. What had she expected? That a single, tentative headbutt meant trust? That he'd lead her to the answers behind the peeling paint? Shame washed over her, hot and prickly. She'd pushed too far. She'd invaded his sacred space, his patient vigil, and scared him away. The fragile connection she'd felt moments ago now seemed like a cruel illusion. The hollow ache returned, sharper, edged with a new kind of loneliness, the loneliness of having glimpsed something real only to have it snatched away. Pushing stiffly to her feet, her jeans damp and cold, Sarah made her way back through the gap in the fence. The alley felt grimier, colder. The walk back to her apartment was a blur of gray concrete and self-reproach. Stepping inside felt like entering a tomb. The ticking of the rooster clock was deafening. The silence pressed down, heavier than before, now saturated with the ghost of that fleeting connection. She looked at the blue ceramic bowl on the counter, the one she'd used for his tuna. Empty. A stark reminder. She didn't expect him back. Not the next morning, or the one after that. She left the bowl out anyway, filled with tuna, a silent apology placed on the top step. Ritual. Habit. A small defiance against the crushing weight of her own mistake. Each day, she'd peek through the kitchen window, heart sinking a little further when she saw the untouched bowl, the empty step. The lilac bush across the alley offered no sign of movement. Samson had retreated completely. The days grew shorter, the November chill deepening, seeping into the bones of the old building. Sarah unpacked another box marked Mom. Photographs. Her mother laughing on a beach Sarah barely remembered, holding a toddler Sarah aloft. Her mother tending roses in their old garden, the very roses Sarah had neglected in the chaos of packing and grief. Each picture was a small knife twist. The apartment felt colder, emptier without the possibility of that small, scarred presence appearing in the alley. The vacuum was back, and it felt infinite. Then, on the fifth morning, just as dawn was bleeding gray light into the sky, she saw him. Not by the bowl. Not under the lilac. He was sitting on the low brick wall bordering her tiny concrete yard, perfectly still, facing her door. Sarah's breath caught. He looked thinner, more ragged, but his green eyes were fixed on her kitchen window. Waiting, assessing. Slowly, cautiously, she opened the back door just a crack. He didn't bolt. He watched her. She slid the blue bowl, freshly filled, onto the step. The pungent smell of tuna hit the cold air. Samson's nostrils flared. He stood, stretched with agonizing slowness, each movement deliberate. Then he padded down the steps, approached the bowl, and began to eat. He ate with the same fierce, focused intensity as before, but his body was tense, ears swiveling constantly. He was listening, watching, vulnerable. He finished the tuna, licked the bowl meticulously clean. Then, instead of lingering or looking towards her door, he turned and walked purposefully back down the alley. Towards the gap in the fence. Towards the blue door. The ritual was back. But the tentative trust? That seemed lost. Sarah didn't follow that day. Or the next. She watched him go each morning after his tuna, a small, determined figure swallowed by the alley's gloom. The pull to understand, to somehow mend the fragile bridge she damaged, was a constant hum beneath her grief. But the fear of driving him away permanently held her back. She contented herself with the routine, the bowl, the watching, the silent offering. It was Mrs. Henderson who unwittingly ignited the next spark. Sarah encountered her one blustery afternoon, struggling with bags of groceries near the building's entrance. Mrs. Henderson, a woman whose face seemed permanently etched with mild disapproval behind thick spectacles, peered at Sarah. "Still feeding that mangy stray deer?" she asked, her voice carrying over the wind. "The ginger and white one? Looks like he's been through a wood chipper." Sarah nodded, shifting her bags. "Samson. He's particular." Mrs. Henderson sniffed. "Particular is one word. Nuisance is another. Seen him lurking around old Mr. Peterson's place down the alley. You know, the big Victorian? Backs onto the yards." She leaned in conspiratorially. "Old Mr. Peterson passed, must be nearly 2 years ago now. Lived there forever. Quiet man. Kept to himself. Place has been empty since. Boarded up tight, I heard. Waiting on some distant relative or probate or some such nonsense." She adjusted her glasses. "That cat, he used to belong to Mr. Peterson. Saw him sitting on the porch with the old man sometimes, summers ago. Never friendly, mind you. Skittish thing." The information landed like a pebble dropped into still water, sending ripples through Sarah's understanding. Mr. Peterson. The silent house had a name. An owner. And Samson. He hadn't just found a quiet spot. He'd been waiting for his person. For 2 years. The refusal of anything but tuna suddenly clicked with heartbreaking clarity. Mr. Peterson must have fed him tuna. It wasn't pickiness. It was fidelity. A desperate clinging to the last tangible link to the one who was gone. That night, the silence in Sarah's apartment felt different. It wasn't just her own grief echoing back at her. It was layered with the phantom grief of a cat sitting vigil before a blue door. Two souls, adrift, anchored to different ghosts. She looked at the photograph of her mother on the mantle, vibrant, alive. Samson had no photograph. Only the memory of Tuna, and a door that wouldn't open. The next morning, after Samson ate his tuna and began his solemn trek down the alley, Sarah made a decision. She wouldn't follow him into the garden. Not yet. But she could observe, understand the scope of his vigil. She pulled on a thick coat, wound a scarf around her neck, and walked down the alley, not towards the gap in the fence, but further along, towards the street where the grand old Victorian faced the world. The house was imposing, even in its neglect. 3 stories of faded red brick, intricate gingerbread trim sagging in places, tall windows shuttered tight. The small front yard was a jungle of overgrown shrubs and weeds. A no trespassing sign, faded and peeling, was nailed crookedly to the porch railing. It looked utterly abandoned, desolate. Sarah stood across the street, partially hidden by a large oak tree, its last few brown leaves clinging stubbornly. She felt like a spy, her heart pounding. She didn't have to wait long. Movement. Not at the front, but along the side of the house, near where the alley ran behind. Samson emerged from a gap beneath the sagging porch steps. He padded across the patchy, frost-touched weeds towards the side gate leading to the back garden. The gate was old wood, warped, hanging slightly ajar on one hinge. Samson squeezed through the narrow opening without hesitation. He didn't look around. He was focused, intent, heading towards his post at the blue door. Sarah watched the gate swing slightly in the breeze after he disappeared. The image of him slipping through, day after day, year after year, to sit and wait for a man who would never return, was profoundly sad. Yet there was a fierce dignity in it too, an unwavering loyalty that defied reason. She started walking home, lost in thought. The mystery of the blue door was partially solved, yet it felt deeper, heavier. It wasn't just a house. It was Samson's entire world, reduced to a single point of hope before a threshold that remained closed. And she was an intruder in that world. That evening, as dusk settled, painting the sky bruised purple and orange, Sarah was washing dishes. The clatter of plates, the rush of water, familiar sounds. Then a different sound. Faint, persistent, a rhythmic scraping. Scritch, 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 scritch. She turned off the tap. Listened. It was coming from outside. From the direction of the back door. Her heart leapt. Samson? She hurried to the door, wiping her hands, and peered through the window. Not Samson. The alley was empty. But the sound continued. Scritch, scritch. It seemed to be coming from below, near the foundation of her building. Sarah frowned. Probably just a branch in the wind. Or a rat. The old buildings near the yards were full of them. She dismissed it, turning back to the sink. But the sound returned the next night. And the next. Always around dusk. Always that same rhythmic scraping. Scritch, 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 scritch. It was too deliberate. Too patterned. Not random. It wormed its way into her consciousness, a persistent, unsettling counterpoint to the ticking clock. One particularly cold night, the scraping started again, louder, more frantic. Sarah couldn't ignore it. She grabbed a flashlight, pulled on boots, and cautiously opened the back door. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the cracked concrete steps, the patchy weeds at the edge of her tiny yard, the damp brick wall of the building. The scraping stopped instantly. Silence. She swept the beam slowly across the ground. Nothing. Then, the light caught a flicker of movement near the base of the wall, where it met the frost-hardened earth. Something small and dark darted into a narrow gap where the foundation mortar had crumbled away. Too big for a mouse. Too quick. Sarah knelt, shining the light directly into the gap. It was narrow, dark. She saw nothing but damp earth and crumbling brick. But a faint, familiar scent drifted out, pungent, briny. Tuna. And something else, the earthy, slightly sweet smell of cat. Samson? Was he trying to get in? But why here? He had his vigil at the blue door. Her apartment was just a source of tuna, not a home. She stood up, bewildered. The scraping didn't resume. The alley was silent again, the only sound the distant wail of a train whistle. She went back inside, locking the door, the mystery deepening. The blue door vigil was one thing. This nocturnal scraping at her own foundation was something else entirely. Unsettling. Confusing. The next afternoon, she went back to the Victorian. Not to spy, but to look, to understand the layout. She walked slowly along the sidewalk, trying to see past the overgrown shrubs. The gap Samson used beneath the porch steps. It was directly below what would have been the living room. The blue door at the back was off the kitchen, she assumed. And her own apartment building, it sat parallel to the Victorian, separated by the alley and the deep back gardens. Her back door faced the alley. The Victorian's back door faced its own garden. They weren't directly aligned. She walked back to her building, stood in her kitchen, looking out the window towards the alley and the Victorian beyond. Mentally, she traced lines. The gap under the Victorian's porch, the blue door, her own back door, the scraping spot near her foundation. It felt like points on a map, but the connection was elusive. That night, the scraping returned. Scritch, scritch, scritch. Louder. More insistent. It sounded less like digging and more like clawing. Trying to get through something. Sarah lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the sound echoing in the quiet apartment. It wasn't fear she felt, exactly. It was a growing, gnawing tension. A puzzle with pieces that didn't fit. Samson's daily pilgrimage to the blue door. His refusal of anything but Tuna. His wary tolerance of her. And now, this nightly, frantic activity beneath her own home. What was he trying to reach? What was he trying to tell her? She thought of the look in his eyes when he'd pressed his head against her knuckles. That wasn't just tolerance. There had been a flicker of something else. A plea? Had she misunderstood? Was the blue door vigil only part of the story? The scraping stopped abruptly. Silence descended, thick and heavy. Sarah held her breath, listening. Then a new sound, faint, muffled, coming not from outside, but seemingly from within the wall near her bed. A sound like whimpering? A low, distressed mule, choked and desperate. It lasted only a few seconds, then was gone, swallowed by the silence. Sarah sat bolt upright in bed, her heart hammering against her ribs. The sound hadn't come from outside. It had come from inside the walls. Cold dread washed over her, followed by a surge of adrenaline. That hadn't been Samson. The pitch was wrong. Too high. Too young. The pieces crashed together with terrifying clarity. The frantic scraping outside, not trying to get in, but perhaps trying to get to something trapped within the walls? Something small? Something vulnerable? And Samson, was he not just mourning at the blue door? Was he trying to rescue something? The silence now was absolute. Oppressive. The image of Samson sitting vigil at the blue door flashed in her mind, overlaying the phantom sound of that desperate mule. His loyalty wasn't just to the past. It was to something present, something trapped, something suffering. The hollow ache inside Sarah vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp urgency. The mystery of the tuna, the blue door, the silent house, it wasn't just about grief anymore. It was about life. Right now. Trapped and terrified. And Samson, the battle-scarred stray who refused all but Tuna, was the only one who knew. The only one trying to help. She threw back the covers, her hands trembling. She had to get into that garden. She had to get to Samson. Not tomorrow. Not at dawn. The vigil at the blue door wasn't just memory, it was a desperate signal. And the scraping beneath her wall was a frantic SOS she could no longer ignore. The quiet shift in her heart wasn't just curiosity or connection anymore. It was a silent scream demanding action. The closed blue door wasn't just a symbol of loss. It was the barrier between her and a truth she could no longer turn away from. The silence after that phantom mule was worse than any sound. It was a vacuum sucking at Sarah's courage. Trapped. The word echoed in the cold, dark room. Something small, helpless, was trapped within the walls of this decaying building, and the only creature who seemed to know, who seemed to care, was a half-feral cat driven by a loyalty older than time. Samson wasn't just mourning at the blue door, he was trying to mount a rescue. And failing. Sarah didn't hesitate. Fear was a luxury she couldn't afford. She flung herself out of bed, her bare feet hitting the icy floorboards. She grabbed the heavy flashlight from the kitchen drawer, her fingers fumbling, slick with cold sweat. A coat? Boots? No time. The image of Samson, ribs stark beneath his fur, relentlessly scraping at the frozen earth beneath her wall, fueled her. The memory of that desperate, muffled cry, high-pitched, terrified, propelled her forward. She yanked open the back door. The November night hit her like a physical blow. Wind, sharp and laced with sleet, tore at her thin pajamas, instantly chilling her to the bone. The alley was a canyon of impenetrable black, the weak glow of a distant streetlight swallowed by the storm. Rain slanted down, stinging her face. She clicked on the flashlight. The beam cut a shaky path through the downpour, illuminating the slick pavement, the overflowing gutters, the dark gap beneath her building's foundation where the scraping had come from. Empty. No sign of Samson. No sound but the howl of the wind and the drumming rain on metal dumpsters. The blue door. He'd be there. He was always there. His base camp. His command post in this desperate siege. Sarah didn't think. She ran. Sleet soaked her pajamas instantly, plastering her hair to her face. Her bare feet slipped on the wet concrete, the cold burning her soles. She didn't care. The flashlight beam bounced erratically as she sprinted down the alley, past the skeletal lilac bush, past Mr. Gable's dark window, towards the gap in the fence leading to Mr. Peterson's forgotten garden. She crashed through the gap, branches tearing at her arms, thorns snagging her soaked pajama top. The overgrown garden was a nightmare landscape in the storm. The wind whipped the tall, dead grasses into frenzied waves. Rain lashed down, turning the paths into muddy streams. The stone statue of the woman seemed to weep in the downpour. Sarah swept the flashlight beam across the clearing before the blue door. He was there. A small, sodden mound of ginger and white plastered against the base of the door. Not sitting vigil this time. Tense. His head was pressed low to the warped wood, his body shivering violently. Not from cold alone. From effort. From terror. He was digging. Frantically. His front paws were a blur, claws scrabbling against the worn wood of the doorframe and the muddy ground beneath it. Mud and splinters flew. A low, continuous growl rumbled from his chest, a sound Sarah had never heard before, primal, desperate, edged with a fear that mirrored her own. "Samson!" Sarah yelled, her voice ripped away by the wind. She stumbled towards him, the beam of her light illuminating his frantic efforts. He didn't even glance up. His entire world was reduced to the space beneath that door. His paws were raw, she could see it even in the poor light, caked with mud and what looked like blood. He was tearing himself apart, trying to get under. The mule hadn't come from her wall alone. The realization struck her like lightning. The Victorian and her apartment building shared a party wall. Whatever was trapped, it could be in the interstitial space between the buildings, accessible perhaps only from here. From beneath this door? Sarah dropped to her knees in the mud beside him. The cold shock of it barely registered. "Samson, stop. Let me help." She reached out, not to touch him, but to see where he was digging. He flinched violently at her movement, a hiss exploding from him, fangs bared in the flashlight beam. His eyes, when they finally flicked to her, held pure, feral panic. No recognition. Only the single-minded drive of a parent whose offspring was in mortal peril. "Please," Sarah begged, her voice breaking. "Please, let me help you." She shone the light directly at the base of the door. The wood was old, soft in places with rot. Samson had clawed a shallow depression in the mud, but the gap beneath the door itself was minuscule, less than an inch. Impossible for anything larger than a mouse to squeeze through. And then she heard it. Faint, muffled by the howling wind and the drumming rain, but unmistakable. Not one cry. Thin, reedy, terrified mules, emanating from the darkness beneath the house, beyond the door. Samson redoubled his efforts, a whine escaping him now, mingling with the kitten's cries. He threw his shoulder against the wood, a futile, heartbreaking thud. Sarah acted. Logic abandoned her. Grief abandoned her. There was only this door, this cat, these cries. She scrambled to her feet, slipping in the mud, and grabbed the wrought iron handle of the blue door. It was ice cold, rough with peeling paint. She pulled with all her strength. Nothing. But bolted from within, probably rusted shut after 2 years of abandonment. "No!" The word tore from her throat, raw with frustration. Samson let out a yowl of pure anguish that pierced through the storm. Sarah scanned the door frame, the hinges, the surrounding wall. Solid brick. Impenetrable. The windows were shuttered tight. Her gaze fell on the stone statue. Its base was large, heavy, moss-covered. An idea, born of pure desperation, formed. She dropped the flashlight, letting it lie beam up in the mud, casting a ghastly, upward light on the scene. She wrapped her arms around the cold, wet stone of the statue's base. It was heavier than she imagined. Centuries of rain had sunk it deep into the earth. She strained, muscles screaming in her back and legs, feet slipping in the mud. "Move. Please move." With a sickening, wet sucking sound, the base shifted. Just an inch. Then another. Samson stopped digging, watching her, his green eyes wide in the reflected light, panting heavily. Sarah gritted her teeth, summoned every ounce of strength she possessed, strength fueled by the phantom mules of kittens and the raw agony in Samson's eyes, and heaved again. The statue groaned, tilting precariously. She shoved it sideways, away from the door, with a final, grunting push. It landed on its side in the mud with a heavy thud, revealing the patch of earth it had covered for decades. Sarah snatched up the flashlight. The beam revealed not packed earth, but rotted wood. A section of the porch decking hidden beneath the statue's base had completely given way to decay. She dropped to her knees again, ignoring the icy mud soaking through to her skin. She clawed at the soft, waterlogged wood with her bare hands. It splintered easily, crumbling like wet cardboard. Samson was beside her instantly, not growling now, but watching, trembling, his nose twitching frantically at the hole she was making. The kitten's cries were louder now, clearer. Desperate. She tore away handfuls of rotten timber, enlarging the hole. The smell that wafted up was dank, earthy, thick with the pungent scent of cat urine and fear. She shone the light down. Darkness. A crawl space beneath the porch. And then movement. Two tiny shapes, huddled together in a shallow depression in the dirt, sodden and shivering. Eyes squeezed shut, tiny mouths open in silent screams of terror they were too exhausted to voice. Kittens. Barely a few weeks old. One ginger and white, like a miniature Samson. One pure, bedraggled black. Samson let out a sound, a high, keening trill Sarah had never heard from him. He tried to push past her into the hole, but it was still too small for him. He paced the edge, whining, tail lashing. It's okay, babies," Sarah cried, her voice thick with tears she hadn't realized were falling. "I've got you." She reached down, carefully, gently. The kittens were freezing, limp with cold and fear. She scooped them up, cradling their tiny, trembling bodies against her soaked pajama top, trying to impart some warmth. They were feather-light, fragile. The ginger one gave a weak mewl. The black one didn't move. Samson was beside her, sniffing frantically at the kittens in her arms, nuzzling them with his wet nose, licking the mud from their fur with quick, rasping strokes of his tongue. His entire body vibrated with a purr so loud and deep it seemed to shake the ground beneath them, a sound of pure, overwhelming relief and primal love. He looked up at Sarah, his green eyes meeting hers in the beam of the fallen flashlight. The feral panic was gone, replaced by an exhausted, dazed gratitude so profound it stole her breath. It wasn't just about the tuna anymore. It was about this moment, this rescue. He pressed his head, hard and cold and wet, against her arm where she cradled the kittens. Not a tentative bridge this time. A full-body lean. A transfer of trust. A silent, shuddering thank you. Sarah knelt in the freezing mud, rain plastering her hair to her face, sleet stinging her skin, holding two half-frozen kittens against her heart, with a battle-scarred cat leaning his entire weight against her, purring like a broken engine. The storm raged around them, wind howling, rain lashing, the old Victorian groaning in protest. But within the small circle of light, within the space where their bodies met, there was only warmth. A fierce, shared warmth born of desperation and relief. The hollow ache that had defined Sarah's existence for months hadn't vanished. It had been momentarily filled to overflowing. Filled with the frantic beat of tiny hearts against her palm, the rough vibration of Samson's purr against her arm, the overwhelming, messy, terrifying reality of life clinging on against impossible odds. She looked down at the tiny black kitten, still frighteningly still. "No," she whispered, her voice raw. "No, you don't." She brought the kitten closer to her face, breathing warm air onto its tiny body, rubbing it gently with her fingers. "Come on, little one. Breathe." Samson nudged the kitten with his nose, licking its face urgently, a low whine replacing the purr. Then a miracle. A tiny, shuddering gasp. The black kitten's sides heaved. Its eyes, tightly shut, fluttered open for a second, deep, unfocused blue. It gave a feeble, rasping mewl. Samson's purr roared back, louder than ever. He pressed his head harder against Sarah's arm, his entire body trembling with the force of it. His gaze held hers, sea glass green meeting her rain-blurred eyes. In that shared look, amidst the tempest, passed 1,000 unspoken things. The depth of his vigil, the reason for the tuna, the only food he knew would sustain him long enough to keep trying. The frantic scraping at her wall, the closest point he could get to the shared space where his cries echoed. The silent plea she'd finally understood. He wasn't just waiting for the past. He was fighting for the future. And in that freezing, muddy garden, kneeling before a broken blue door with a rescued family huddled against her, Sarah saw her own reflection in Samson's exhausted, grateful eyes. She saw the caregiver, the rescuer, not just the grieving daughter adrift in silence. The vacuum hadn't just been filled, it had been shattered, obliterated by the piercing cries of kittens and the thunderous purr of a cat who had finally been heard. The door wasn't just open, it was demolished. And on the other side wasn't just loss, but life, fragile and demanding, needing her now. The connection wasn't fragile anymore. It was forged in mud and desperation, as solid and unbreakable as the stone statue lying toppled in the storm. The blue door vigil was over. The rescue had begun. The storm raged outside Sarah's apartment windows, hurling sleet against the glass like handfuls of gravel. Inside, it was a different world. A world transformed by chaos, warmth, and the frantic, fragile pulse of new life. The radiator hissed and clanked, fighting a losing battle against the November chill, but the small kitchen felt like the center of a universe. Sarah sat on the floor, wrapped in a thick, borrowed quilt Mrs. Henderson had thrust at her with wide, scandalized eyes after seeing Sarah stumble back into the alley, soaked and muddy, clutching kittens and trailed by a dripping, wild-eyed cat. The quilt smelled faintly of mothballs and lavender, a jarring counterpoint to the earthy, milky, slightly feral scent that now permeated the small space. Before her, nestled in a deep cardboard box lined with towels Sarah had warmed in the dryer, were the kittens. The ginger and white one, a tiny mirror image of Samson, right down to the slightly crooked tail, was already showing signs of spirit. He wobbled on unsteady legs, batting weakly at a soft sock Sarah had balled up for him, letting out high-pitched, demanding squeaks. His sister, the black kitten, was the cause for the tight knot of worry still lodged beneath Sarah's ribs. She lay curled tightly, breathing shallowly, her tiny sides barely moving. Sarah had painstakingly wiped the mud from her fur with a warm, damp cloth, revealing fur as soft as thistledown, deep and dark as a moonless night. She'd managed to get a few drops of warmed kitten formula into her using a dropper, but the response had been feeble. Little Shadow, Sarah thought, the name forming unbidden, a plea for her to hold on. And then there was Samson. He hadn't fled. He'd followed Sarah back through the storm, a silent, dripping shadow, never letting the box containing his kittens out of his sight. Now, he sat a few feet away from the box, perched rigidly on a kitchen chair Sarah had pulled out. He wasn't relaxed. Every muscle was taut, ears pricked forward, sea glass eyes fixed unblinkingly on the tiny forms in the box. Water still beaded on his patchy fur, making him look even more skeletal. His paws, Sarah could see clearly now under the bright kitchen light, were raw. The pads were scraped, one claw torn halfway off, caked with dried mud and blood from his frantic digging. He trembled faintly, a constant vibration beneath the wet fur. Not purring. Not yet. Just watching. Guarding. His vigilance was absolute, a force field radiating from his battered body. Sarah understood. He'd entrusted her with his most precious things. But trust, especially for a creature like Samson, forged in abandonment and fierce loyalty to a ghost, was a fragile, terrifying thing. He wasn't sure. He needed to see. He needed to know. She moved slowly, telegraphing every action. She dipped the dropper into the warm formula again. "Come on, Shadow," she murmured, her voice husky from shouting in the storm, raw from unshed tears. "Just a little more. For your dad." She carefully slid the dropper tip near Shadow's tiny mouth. The kitten didn't stir. Sarah gently stroked the side of her face with a fingertip. Nothing. A low sound came from the chair. Not a growl. A soft, guttural rumble of pure anxiety. Sarah glanced up. Samson was leaning forward, his whole body straining towards the box, his green eyes wide with a helpless fear that mirrored her own. He met her gaze, and in that shared look was the echo of the storm, the desperate scramble in the mud, the terrifying silence when Shadow hadn't breathed. It was a silent cry, "Help her." Sarah dipped her finger into the formula, coating the tip. Gently, ever so gently, she rubbed the sticky liquid onto Shadow's lips. A tiny pink tongue flicked out. Twice. Sarah held her breath. Then, slowly, miraculously, the tiny mouth opened, seeking. Sarah quickly offered the dropper. Shadow suckled weakly, swallowing a few precious drops. Samson let out a breath Sarah hadn't realized he was holding. It was a shuddering sigh that seemed to deflate him slightly. He settled back on the chair, his gaze never leaving Shadow, but the rigid tension in his shoulders eased a fraction. He watched Sarah feed his daughter, his eyes following every movement of her hand, every drop swallowed. It was the most profound act of supervision Sarah had ever witnessed. Later, when both kittens were fed as much as they would take and drowsing in the warmth of their nest, Sprout, the ginger one, sprawled like a tiny conqueror, Shadow curled tightly but breathing more steadily, Sarah risked it. She had gently cleaned Samson's wounded paws with warm water and a soft cloth, whispering soothing nonsense. He'd flinched but allowed it, his eyes fixed on the box. Now, she placed a small dish of tuna, the good stuff, packed in oil, on the floor near the chair. He looked at it, looked at her, looked back at the kittens. Hunger warred with duty. Finally, with a reluctance that spoke volumes, he jumped down. He approached the dish cautiously, casting frequent glances back at the box. He ate quickly, efficiently, the way he always did, but his ears remained swiveled towards his sleeping offspring. When he finished, he didn't return to the chair. He walked directly to the box. He sniffed each kitten thoroughly, nuzzling them, his rough tongue rasping over their fur in slow, deliberate strokes. Then, to Sarah's astonishment, he stepped carefully into the box. He was far too big. He half-curled his body around the kittens, his head resting on the edge, his watchful eyes still open, still fixed on Sarah. A low, hesitant rumble started deep in his chest. A purr. Tentative. Fragile. But undeniably there. A sound of exhausted, vigilant contentment. He was where he needed to be. Guarding. Warming. Present. Sarah sat back against the cabinet, pulling the quilt tighter. The radiator hissed. The sleet rattled the window panes. Inside the box, 3 cats breathed. Sprout's tiny snores. Shadow's shallow, steady inhalations. And the deep, resonant vibration of Samson's purr, a bass note anchoring the fragile symphony of their survival. The hollow ache in Sarah's chest didn't vanish. The grief for her mother was still a tangible thing, a photograph on the mantel. But it wasn't the only thing occupying that space anymore. It was now layered with the fierce, protective worry for Shadow, the absurd delight at Sprout's clumsy antics, and the overwhelming, humbling weight of Samson's trust. The silence of the apartment wasn't silence at all. It was filled with the sounds of life, fragile, demanding, precious life, that she was now responsible for. The vacuum had been irrevocably shattered. The days that followed were a blur of exhaustion and tiny milestones. Sarah became an expert in kitten formula temperatures, stimulating elimination with a warm cloth, a task she approached with grim determination, and the delicate art of sleeping in shifts. She named the ginger kitten Sprout for his determined, wobbly growth. Shadow, true to her name, remained quieter, smaller, clinging to her brother and her father with a silent intensity that worried Sarah. But she ate. She gained a little weight. Her blue eyes began to focus. Samson's transformation was slower, more complex. He never left the kittens for long. He slept in the box, a protective fortress of scarred fur and bone. He cleaned them obsessively. He watched Sarah's every move with them, a silent, green-eyed supervisor. But he wouldn't let her touch him beyond the necessary paw cleaning. He'd tolerate her proximity while she tended the kittens, his purr a low, constant thrum. But if her hands strayed towards him, he'd tense, the purr cutting off abruptly, a wary distance returning to his eyes. The tuna was accepted, but it felt transactional. Fuel for his vigil. He also began disappearing. Not for long. An hour, maybe two, during the quiet lulls when the kittens were deeply asleep. At first, Sarah panicked, imagining him hurt, lost, or worse, abandoning them again. But he always returned. Muddy-pawed, sometimes with a faint, dusty smell clinging to his fur. She knew where he went. The pull of the blue door of Mr. Peterson's silent house was still there. A part of his heart remained on vigil, even as the other part fiercely guarded his new family in Sarah's kitchen. It wasn't abandonment. It was pilgrimage, a necessary tending to a different kind of memory. Sarah understood that too. Grief wasn't linear. It had compartments. Samson had simply added a new one, right next to the old. One crisp, sunny afternoon about a week after the storm, Sarah was sitting on the floor near the box. Sprout was attempting to climb the towel mountain, tumbling back with indignant squeaks. Shadow watched, a tiny black statue, occasionally batting a paw at her brother's tail. Samson was stretched out beside the box, eyes half closed, purring softly in a patch of sunlight. The radiator clanked, a familiar sound. Sarah looked at the stack of unpacked boxes against the wall. One, marked Mom's Kitchen in her own handwriting, seemed to catch the light. Without overthinking, she stood up. She walked to the box, pulled out the packing tape dispenser, and sliced through the tape. The cardboard flaps fell open. Inside, nestled in crumpled newspaper, were familiar treasures. Her mother's favorite yellow mixing bowl, chipped on the rim. The wooden spoon worn smooth from decades of stirring. The cheerful, slightly lopsided ceramic rooster cookie jar. Sarah lifted the cookie jar. It felt solid, comforting in her hands. She hadn't been able to look at it before. Now, she placed it carefully on her own kitchen counter. Not in the spot her mother's had occupied in the old house, but on the windowsill where the weak November sun could catch its bright colors. She felt Samson's gaze. He was sitting up now, watching her, his head tilted. He looked from the cookie jar to her face. His green eyes held a quiet curiosity. No judgment, just observation. Sarah offered him a small, tired smile. "Just making some space," she murmured. Later that evening, after feeding the kittens and settling them, Sarah sat on the sofa with a mug of tea. She was bone-tired, but a different kind of tired. A fulfilling exhaustion. Sprout and Shadow were curled together in their box, a tangle of ginger and black fur, breathing deeply. Samson wasn't in the box. He wasn't on the chair. Sarah's breath hitched. Had he gone back to the Victorian? Then she saw him. He was sitting in the patch of darkness just inside her slightly open bedroom door. The room was dark, illuminated only by the sliver of light from the kitchen. He was facing into the room, utterly still. Sarah held her breath. This was the first time he'd ventured beyond the kitchen. She watched, not daring to move. Slowly, deliberately, he took a step forward. Then another. He walked into the center of the small bedroom. He stopped. He turned in a slow circle, sniffing the air. He looked at the bed, at the dresser, at the unpacked boxes still stacked in the corner. His gaze lingered on the photograph of Sarah's mother on the nightstand. He walked over to the bed. He stretched, one stiff foreleg extending, claws gently scraping the worn rug. Then, with infinite care, he jumped up. Not onto the bed itself, but onto the old, folded quilt at the foot of it, the one her mother had made. He circled once, twice, kneading the fabric tentatively with his scarred paws. Then, with a sigh that seemed to come from the very depths of him, he settled down. He curled into a tight circle, tucked his nose under his tail, and closed his eyes. His purr started, low and deep and resonant, filling the quiet room. It wasn't the vigilant purr of the kitchen box. It was the purr of deep, hard-earned rest. He wasn't just guarding the kittens. He was staying. Sarah sat on the sofa, the warmth of the mug seeping into her hands, tears silently tracing paths down her cheeks. Not tears of sadness. Tears of a profound, almost unbearable relief and gratitude. Samson hadn't just accepted her help for his kittens. He'd chosen her space, her scent, her mother's quilt. He had, in his own wounded, cautious way, crossed the final threshold. The blue door vigil continued, a part of his soul forever anchored to Mr. Peterson. But here, in the quiet of her bedroom, on a quilt stitched with love by a woman he'd never met, he had found a place to truly rest. To be more than just a guardian. To be home. The radiator hissed. The rooster cookie jar gleamed softly on the windowsill. In the kitchen, Sprout let out a sleepy squeak. In the bedroom, Samson's purr rumbled on, a deep, steady counterpoint to the silence that was no longer empty, but filled with the fragile, resilient music of a family finding its shape. The hollow ache remained, a familiar landscape, but it was now a valley nourished by new rivers, the insistent flow of kitten paws, the deep current of a scarred cat's trust, and the quiet, steady stream of her own healing heart, learning to beat for more than just the memory of what was lost. The vigil at the blue door wasn't forgotten, but here, in the warm, messy reality of her apartment, a different kind of watch had begun. A watch over the future. Winter tightened its grip. December arrived, sharp and glittering, frosting the cracked alley pavement and painting the skeletal branches of the lilac bush in lace. Inside Sarah's apartment, however, a different kind of frost was thawing, replaced by a warmth that was chaotic, demanding, and utterly transformative. Sprout lived up to his name. He was a whirlwind of ginger and white fluff, a tiny tornado discovering the world with reckless abandon. He scaled towel mountains, launched kamikaze attacks on dust bunnies, and perfected the art of dangling precariously from the edge of the cardboard box, mewling dramatically until rescued. His energy was boundless, a constant, joyful counterpoint to the lingering chill outside. Shadow, true to her name, remained quieter, more observant. She gained weight steadily, her black fur becoming sleek and deep. Her blue kitten eyes slowly shifted towards green, mirroring her father's sea glass gaze, but held a watchful, almost solemn depth. She followed Sprout's antics with regal patience, occasionally deigning to bat a paw at his swishing tail, but her true sanctuary remained curled against Samson's side or tucked into the warm hollow behind his scarred flank. Samson's vigilance hadn't lessened, but it had softened. He still slept mostly in or beside the box, a protective fortress. He still cleaned his kittens with meticulous, rasping strokes. He still watched Sarah's every interaction with them, his green eyes missing nothing. But the rigid tension had eased. He allowed Sarah to handle the kittens freely, his purr rumbling approval when she cuddled them or fed them their mushy kitten food, a significant upgrade from formula. He'd even started venturing further into the apartment, exploring the living room with cautious sniffs, though the bedroom, particularly the quilt at the foot of the bed, remained his chosen sanctuary for deep, purring sleep. The tuna, however, remained his sole sustenance. He'd sniff disdainfully at the kitten food, at the expensive kibble Sarah offered him, even at freshly cooked chicken. Only the briny scent of tuna flakes in oil elicited that familiar, focused intensity. It was his ritual, his anchor. Sarah accepted it. It was part of the pact, the unspoken agreement forged in the freezing mud before the blue door. Fuel for the Guardian. One blustery afternoon, the sky threatening snow, Sarah bundled up. The kittens were napping, Samson a warm, watchful presence beside the box. She needed groceries, including, inevitably, more tuna. Pulling on her coat, she glanced at the stack of unpacked boxes. Only one remained, tucked in the corner of the living room, marked simply, Mom's Memories. She'd avoided it, the weight of its contents feeling too heavy amidst the fragile new life blooming in her kitchen. But today, looking at Samson gently nuzzling Shadow, the quiet domesticity of the scene struck her. Life wasn't just about the absence carved by grief. It was about the presence demanded by these small, breathing creatures. She needed space. Space for kitten toys, for a proper scratching post she planned to buy, space for them to grow. The box couldn't stay a monument to avoidance. Taking a deep breath, she dragged the box into the center of the living room. Samson lifted his head, watching her with quiet curiosity as she sliced through the packing tape. The flaps opened, releasing a familiar scent, lavender sachets, old paper, the faintest hint of her mother's perfume. Inside, nestled carefully, were photo albums wrapped in tissue paper, a small wooden jewelry box, bundles of letters tied with faded ribbon, and several smaller boxes. Sarah began unpacking slowly, deliberately. The photo albums went onto the bookshelf. The jewelry box, containing her mother's modest treasures, a locket, a cameo brooch, found a place on her dresser. The letters, mostly from Sarah's father written decades ago, she set aside for another day. She reached for the last item, a small, sturdy cardboard box, unmarked. Opening it, she found it wasn't her mother's. Inside were layers of yellowed newspaper. Nestled within were cat things. A small, worn ceramic dish, chipped at the rim, painted with faded blue fish. A tiny, felt mouse, bald in patches, missing one button eye. And a stack of Polaroid photographs, the colors faded, the edges curled. Sarah sat back on her heels, her heart thudding strangely. She picked up the fish dish. It felt cool, smooth in her hands. She picked up the top Polaroid. The image was slightly blurry, but clear enough. An old man sat in a wicker rocking chair on a sun-dappled porch. He was thin, his face lined but kind, his eyes crinkled at the corners in a gentle smile. On his lap, curled contentedly, was a young cat. Sleek, unblemished ginger and white fur. Bright, alert green eyes. No notched ear. No scars. Just a look of pure, unguarded contentment. It was unmistakably Samson. Younger. Utterly at peace. The old man's hand rested lightly on the cat's back, a gesture of quiet affection. Sarah flipped through the photos. Samson perched on the arm of the chair, watching birds. Samson batting playfully at a ball of yarn. Samson sitting proudly beside a bowl, a blue ceramic bowl filled with... Sarah peered closer. Tuna flakes. Mr. Peterson feeding him tuna. The only food he would accept. It wasn't just fidelity, it was the echo of love served in a specific dish. The final photo took her breath away. It showed Mr. Peterson holding a tiny ginger kitten, no bigger than Sprout, cupped gently in his large, weathered hands. The kitten's eyes were wide, blue, unfocused. Samson, barely older than a kitten himself, sat beside the old man's elbow, his head tilted, his green eyes fixed intently on the tiny scrap of fur. The caption, written in a shaky hand on the white border, read, "Samson meets Little Scout. Instant guardian." Mr. Peterson's name for the ginger kitten. Sarah looked towards the kitchen, where Sprout, her accidental namesake for the same spirit, was beginning to stir. A shiver ran through her, a connection snapping taut across time and loss. Samson hadn't just lost his person, he'd lost his role. Guardian. Protector. Mr. Peterson had given him that purpose with Little Scout. And when Mr. Peterson vanished, and Scout likely grew up and wandered off or... Sarah didn't let herself finish the thought. Samson had been left anchorless. Until now. Until Sprout and Shadow. The little ceramic fish dish felt heavy in her hands. Not just an object, but a vessel of memory. Samson's memory. His connection to the man who had loved him, who had fed him tuna, who had entrusted him with a kitten. Sarah understood, with a clarity that brought tears to her eyes, why Samson had refused anything else. It wasn't just taste. It was taste imbued with love, with safety, with home. The blue ceramic bowl she used wasn't just practical, it was, unconsciously, a replica of the ritual he'd shared with Mr. Peterson. She carried the fish dish and the felt mouse into the kitchen. Samson was awake, watching Sprout attempt to climb his tail. Sarah placed the fish dish gently on the floor beside his usual tuna plate. She placed the felt mouse nearby. Samson froze. His entire body went rigid. His green eyes, fixed on the little blue dish, widened impossibly. A low sound escaped him, not a meow, not a growl, but a soft, choked whimper. Recognition, sharp and visceral. He approached slowly, cautiously, as if the dish might vanish. He sniffed it long and deep, his whiskers trembling. He nudged it with his nose. Then he looked up at Sarah, his eyes searching hers, filled with a confusion that bordered on pain. Where had this come from? How did she have this piece of his lost world? He circled the dish, sniffing again. He picked up the felt mouse gently in his mouth, carrying it a few feet away before setting it down and staring at it. He looked back at the dish, back at Sarah. The vulnerability in his gaze was staggering. The tough, scarred exterior was gone, revealing the bewildered, grieving creature beneath. Sarah knelt slowly. She didn't touch him. She just pointed to the dish, then to his usual tuna plate. "It's yours, Samson," she whispered, her voice thick. It always was. She scooped tuna flakes from the can into the little blue fish dish. The familiar pungent smell filled the air. Samson stared at the dish, then at the food. He looked at Sarah again, a silent question hanging between them. Is this okay? Is this real? Slowly, hesitantly, he lowered his head. He took a single flake from the fish dish. He chewed, swallowed. He looked up at Sarah, his eyes huge. Then, with a soft sigh that seemed to release years of tension, he began to eat. Not with the fierce, desperate intensity of before, but with a slow, almost reverent focus. He ate from Mr. Peterson's dish, in Sarah's kitchen, while his kittens played nearby. It was the most profound act of acceptance Sarah had ever witnessed. He wasn't just eating tuna, he was reclaiming a fragment of his past, integrating it into his present. He was acknowledging that his love for Mr. Peterson could coexist with his fierce protection of Sprout and Shadow, and his cautious, growing trust in her. The fish dish wasn't replacing the blue bowl, it was joining it. A bridge between then and now. The next morning dawned clear and bitterly cold, the first real snowfall dusting the alley in a pristine layer of white. Sarah had an appointment. It was time. She carefully bundled Sprout and Shadow into a carrier lined with a warm blanket. Samson watched, tense but not panicked. He seemed to understand this was important. The vet's office was bright and sterile smelling. Sprout yowled his indignation at the indignity. Shadow pressed herself into the corner of the carrier, wide-eyed. Samson paced the small exam room floor, his tail twitching, his eyes never leaving the carrier. When the vet, a cheerful woman with kind eyes, lifted Sprout out, Samson let out a low growl, instantly silencing when Sarah rested a calming hand on his back. It's okay, big guy. She's helping. The checkup was thorough. Sprout was declared a robust, healthy menace. Shadow, though smaller, was catching up well, her lungs clear, her heart strong. They're beautiful, the vet murmured, scratching Shadow's chin. Lucky little ones. She turned her attention to Samson. And this must be Dad. He looks like he's seen some things. She examined him gently, cleaning the last remnants of scabs from his paws, checking his teeth, running her hands over his scarred body. He tolerated it with stoic dignity, his eyes fixed on his kittens. He's underweight, but surprisingly healthy considering, the vet concluded. A few scars, that ear, he's a survivor. Strong genes. She smiled at Sarah. They definitely take after him, especially the ginger one. The family resemblance is striking. Family. The word hung in the air, warm and solid. Sarah looked at Samson, who was now leaning against her leg, his purr a low, steady vibration as he watched Shadow being placed back in the carrier. Family resemblance. It wasn't just genetics. It was the fierce loyalty in Sprout's playful pounce, the watchful depth in Shadow's green eyes, the stubborn resilience etched into every line of Samson's scarred body. They were bound by more than blood. They were bound by rescue, by shared survival, by the quiet, unshakable devotion Samson had carried from a sunny porch to a storm-lashed garden to this warm, chaotic apartment. On the way home, Sarah stopped at the pet store. She bought a sturdy scratching post, a proper set of ceramic dishes, and a small bag of premium kibble. She also bought one more thing, a simple blue ceramic bowl, unadorned. Not to replace the fish dish Mr. Peterson had left behind, but to stand beside it. Back in the apartment, she set up the new dishes near the radiator. She placed Mr. Peterson's little fish dish on the left. She placed the new blue bowl on the right. She filled the fish dish with tuna. She filled the blue bowl with kibble. Samson approached. He sniffed the kibble. He looked at Sarah. He looked at the fish dish full of tuna. Then, slowly, deliberately, he lowered his head and took a single piece of kibble from the blue bowl. He crunched it. Swallowed. He didn't devour the kibble. He ate a few pieces, interspersed with tuna from the fish dish. It was a choice. Not a surrender, but an expansion. An acceptance of the new, alongside the cherished memory of the old. Later that evening, the first true snow falling steadily outside, blanketing the world in silent white, Sarah sat on the floor near the radiator. Sprout was conquering the new scratching post with enthusiastic inefficiency. Shadow sat perched on the sofa arm, watching the snowflakes dance past the window, her green eyes reflecting the streetlights. Samson was grooming Sprout. Not the quick, efficient licks of necessity, but slow, thorough strokes, rasping his tongue over the kitten's fluffy ginger fur, cleaning behind his ears, nuzzling the top of his head. Sprout leaned into it, purring a high, thrumming purr, his tiny body vibrating with contentment. Samson's own purr was a deep, resonant counterpoint, a sound of profound, peaceful belonging. Sarah watched them, the fish dish and the blue bowl sitting side by side on the floor. She looked at the rooster cookie jar on the windowsill, catching the reflection of the falling snow. She thought of her mother's laughter, packed away in photographs but resonating in the warmth of the kitchen. She thought of Mr. Peterson, captured in faded Polaroids, his gentle hand resting on a young, unblemished Samson. She thought of the frantic digging in the storm, the tiny, frozen bodies rescued from the dark. She reached into the box marked Mom's Memories, pulling out the last item she hadn't unpacked, her mother's favorite teacup, delicate porcelain painted with violets. She walked to the kitchen sink and washed it carefully. Then she placed it on the shelf beside the rooster cookie jar. It wasn't hidden away. It was present. A piece of her past, integrated into her present. She made tea. Not in a mug, but in the violet's cup. She sat at the small table, sipping the hot liquid, watching her strange, beautiful, scarred little family. Samson finished grooming Sprout and moved to Shadow, gently licking her sleek black fur. Shadow leaned into him, a soft purr rumbling in her tiny chest. Sprout, momentarily exhausted from his scratching post-conquest, curled up against Samson's side, instantly asleep. The snow fell silently outside. The radiator hissed. The kittens purred. Samson's deep, resonant rumble filled the room, a sound like stones tumbling in a warm river. Sarah took another sip of tea, the delicate china warm against her palm. She looked at Samson, his sea-glass eyes half closed in contentment as he tended to his kittens. She looked at the two bowls on the floor, the old fish dish and the new blue one, sitting peacefully together. The final gift wasn't just the discovery of the fish dish or the photos. It was the understanding that arrived with it, settling into her bones as deeply as the warmth from the tea. Love wasn't erased by loss. It transformed. It migrated. It found new vessels. Mr. Peterson's love for Samson lived on in the scarred cat's fierce devotion to his kittens. Her mother's love lived on in the warmth Sarah offered this broken family, in the unpacked teacup on the shelf. Samson's love for his lost person wasn't diminished by his acceptance of tuna from Sarah's hands, or even kibble from a new blue bowl. It was simply expanded to include Sprout's chaotic energy, Shadow's quiet watchfulness, and the woman who had knelt beside him in the freezing mud, offering her hands, her home, her heart. Sarah set down the violet's cup. She walked over to the huddle of cats near the radiator. She didn't reach to pet Samson. She knew his boundaries. Instead, she gently stroked Sprout's sleeping head, then ran a finger along Shadow's sleek back. She looked down at Samson. His eyes opened fully, meeting hers. There was no wariness now. Only a deep, calm acknowledgement. A shared understanding of the long road behind them and the uncertain, but no longer desolate, road ahead. They had all been lost. They had all been found. Not in the way they expected, but in the way they desperately needed. "Okay, Samson," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the symphony of purrs. "We're okay." Samson held her gaze for a long moment. Then, slowly, deliberately, he closed his eyes again, resting his chin on his paws, his purr deepening. He didn't need to lean against her this time. The bridge was built. The vigil, in its own way, was complete. He was home. They all were. The gift wasn't in the past revealed, but in the present, peacefully shared, the snow falling silently outside, the radiator humming, and the deep, resonant purr of a once-lost guardian finally at rest. Winter deepened, settling over the city like a patient exhale. Snow drifted in soft, silent waves, blanketing the cracked alley pavement, frosting the skeletal lilac bush into a crystal sculpture, and muffling the distant wail of the train whistles. Inside Sarah's apartment, though, winter held a different quality. It wasn't banished, exactly, but held at bay by a fierce, small sun burning at its center. A sun comprised of ginger fur, sleek black shadow, and the deep, resonant purr of a scarred guardian. The transformation wasn't loud, but profound. It lived in the mundane, the daily rituals rewritten by tiny paws and watchful green eyes. The cardboard box was replaced by a plush cat bed nestled near the radiator, though Samson often still chose the quilt at the foot of Sarah's bed for his deepest sleep, a sleep that now came easier, his body less taut, his breathing deeper. The rooster clock still ticked, but its sound was no longer a metronome counting empty hours. It was woven into the tapestry of new sounds, Sprout's high-pitched trills as he launched himself at feathered toys, the soft thump-thump-thump of Shadow batting a crinkly ball across the floor with meticulous precision, and the constant, grounding bass note of Samson's purr, a sound that seemed to vibrate from the very walls. He still visited the blue door. Less frequently now, and for shorter durations. Sarah would sometimes see him slip down the alley on a clear, cold morning, his breath pluming in the air, moving with that old, unhurried purpose. He'd return an hour or so later, sometimes carrying the faint scent of dust and old wood, sometimes just the crisp cold. He'd pause on the back step, shake the snow from his fur, and then pad inside, heading straight for the kittens, nuzzling them, checking on them, before settling down, often with a sigh that sounded like a weight being gently set aside. It wasn't abandonment, it was remembrance. A quiet tending of a sacred space within his heart, a space reserved solely for Mr. Peterson and the ghost of Little Scout. Sarah understood. Grief wasn't a room you left, it was a landscape you learned to walk through, sometimes visiting specific, cherished vistas. Samson carried his with dignity. The fish dish sat proudly beside the new blue bowl. The ritual remained: tuna flakes in the faded ceramic fish, kibble in the simple blue. But the rigidity had softened. Sometimes, after finishing his tuna, Samson would amble over to the blue bowl and casually crunch a few pieces of kibble. Not because he needed to, but because it was there. Because it was new. Because it was part of this place, this rhythm. It was an acceptance, a quiet expansion of his world. He'd even been known to steal a mouthful of the kitten's mushy food on occasion, earning indignant squeaks from Sprout and a look of serene tolerance from Shadow. The tuna wasn't just fuel for grief anymore. It was a cherished taste of love remembered, now shared alongside the flavors of the present. Sprout was a force of nature. His ginger and white fluff seemed to generate its own kinetic energy. He scaled bookshelves, much to Sarah's dismay, conducted elaborate battles with dust motes and sunbeams, and perfected the art of the drive-by cuddle, barreling into Sarah's lap or Samson's side at full tilt before collapsing in a purring heap. He adored his sister, constantly trying to engage her in his chaotic games, batting her tail or pouncing near her. Shadow, true to her name, remained his calm counterpart. She observed the world with ancient, thoughtful green eyes, preferring high perches on the back of the sofa or the windowsill, tracking the falling snow or the sparrows braving the cold. She possessed a quiet, surprising strength, often the one to break up Sprout's more reckless escapades with a gentle but firm paw placed on his head. She reserved her deepest affection for Samson, frequently curling into the warm space beneath his chin, her tiny purr harmonizing with his deep rumble. She was his shadow, his quiet disciple, learning the art of watchfulness. Sarah's own landscape had shifted irrevocably. The unpacked boxes were gone. Her mother's yellow mixing bowl sat on the counter, used regularly. The lopsided rooster cookie jar held actual cookies now. Her mother's Violet's teacup sat beside it, used for quiet moments of tea, no longer a relic behind glass but a vessel for present comfort. The photograph on the mantel wasn't a source of piercing pain, but a warm presence, a reminder of a love that had shaped her capacity to love now. One frigid January evening, the kind where the cold seeped through the walls and the wind howled like a banshee down the alley, Sarah sat on the sofa, a book open but unread on her lap. Sprout was a warm, purring weight on her feet, exhausted from a day of imaginary conquests. Shadow sat regally on the armrest beside her, gazing out at the swirling snow. Samson wasn't on his quilt in the bedroom. He wasn't in the cat bed. He was stretched out on the sofa itself, a respectable distance away, but on the sofa. He was cleaning Sprout's ears with slow, deliberate strokes, his purr a steady engine of contentment. Sarah watched them, the warmth from the radiator, the kittens, and Samson's presence creating a cocoon against the winter outside. She thought about the journey that had led here, the hollow silence after her mother's death, the numbing grief that felt like wandering through fog, the strange, scarred cat turning up his nose at everything but Tuna, the pull of curiosity that had outweighed the fear of the unknown, the storm, the desperate scramble in the freezing mud, the terrifying fragility of those tiny lives, the bone-deep exhaustion and fierce protectiveness that followed, the slow, hard-won trust in Samson's sea-glass eyes, the discovery of the fish dish, the Polaroids, the heartbreaking glimpse into the love that had shaped him before loss. It struck her then, not as a revelation, but as a deep, settled knowing. Rescue wasn't a single act. It wasn't just pulling kittens from the dark. It was a continuous process, a slow unfurling. Samson hadn't just rescued his kittens that night. He'd been rescuing himself. Rescuing his purpose, his reason to keep vigil not just for the past, but for the future. He'd rescued Sarah too. He'd pulled her out of the suffocating silence of her grief, not by erasing it, but by forcing her to look outward, to engage, to care with a ferocity she hadn't known she possessed. He'd shown her that love wasn't finite. It could expand, encompassing new beings, new responsibilities, without diminishing what came before. And she had rescued him right back, offered him shelter, sustenance, safety for his most precious things. She had seen the fierce, grieving guardian beneath the scars and the wariness, and she had offered him a place to finally lower his guard, to rest without abandoning his watch. She had given him back a fragment of his past with the fish dish, and offered him a place in a new future with the blue bowl. She had witnessed his devotion and mirrored it back, creating a sanctuary not just for the kittens, but for his wounded, loyal heart. It was about second chances, yes. But more than that, it was about finding your tribe in the wreckage. It was about recognizing the silent pleas disguised as picky eating or nocturnal scraping. It was about the courage to follow a stray cat into the unknown, driven by a curiosity that feels suspiciously like hope. It was about understanding that grief and joy aren't opposites, but companions on the long road of healing, sometimes walking hand in hand. Sarah closed her book. Sprout stirred, stretched, and resettled with a sigh. Shadow blinked slowly at her, a gesture Sarah had learned was feline contentment. Samson finished cleaning Sprout's ear and lifted his head. His green eyes met Sarah's in the warm lamplight. There was no demand in them, no wariness, only a deep, abiding calm, a sense of being exactly where he was meant to be. He blinked slowly, twice, a silent benediction. Sarah smiled, a soft, genuine thing that started in her eyes and warmed her whole face. She reached out, not towards Samson, but towards Shadow, gently stroking the sleek black fur between her ears. Shadow leaned into the touch, her purr deepening. Samson watched, his own purr resonating through the sofa cushions. Sprout, sensing the shift, rolled onto his back, presenting his fluffy belly in sleepy invitation. Outside, the wind hurled snow against the window pane. The radiator hissed its familiar song. The rooster clock ticked. Inside, the sounds wove together, the wind, the hiss, the tick, the gentle rasp of Sarah's fingers on Shadow's fur, Sprout's sleepy murmurs, and the deep, resonant, intertwined purrs of father and daughter. It wasn't silence. It wasn't the chaotic noise of before the storm. It was music. The complex, beautiful, sometimes discordant, but ultimately harmonious music of a family forged not by blood, but by shared survival, fierce loyalty, and the quiet, persistent power of love that refuses to be extinguished, even in the deepest winter. Sarah leaned back, closing her eyes for a moment, absorbing the symphony. The hollow ache was still there, a familiar contour in her heart. But it was no longer a void. It was a valley now, fertile and rich, nourished by the rivers of Sprout's chaotic joy, Shadow's quiet wisdom, and Samson's steadfast, rumbling presence. It was filled with the echoes of her mother's laughter and Mr. Peterson's gentle smile, woven into the fabric of the present. She was no longer lost, waiting for the phone to ring in a silent apartment. She was found, anchored. Samson stretched, his claws gently kneading the sofa fabric, a sound like soft rain. He settled back down, resting his head on his paws, his gaze drifting towards the window and the swirling snow beyond. He wasn't looking for escape. He was simply observing the world outside, secure in the knowledge of the warm, purring world within. His vigil wasn't over, it had simply changed location. He was home. They all were. And the sound that filled the room, louder than the wind, deeper than the radiator's hiss, was the unmistakable, beautiful sound of being found. Before you go, if this story of second chances and unexpected family resonated with you, please give this video a thumbs up. It truly helps us find more hearts who need stories like this. Subscribe to the channel for more real-life tales of hope, rescue, and the quiet magic animals bring into our lives. Tell us in the comments, where in the world are you listening from? And what was the moment you knew you were home? Share this with someone who understands the language of purrs and the power of a rescued heart. Don't forget to hit the bell icon so you never miss our daily doses of real-life wonder. Thank you deeply for watching. Until the next story, take care of the lost creatures and the found ones, especially the ones looking back at you from your own sofa.